Last Tuesday, I was catching up with a friend I hadn't seen in years. By all traditional metrics, this guy is a winner, high-paying tech job, marathon runner, the kind of person you'd assume sits at the top of every dating app stack. But when I asked him if he was seeing anyone, he didn't give me a name. He gave me a percentage. "I'm at 0%, he said, leaning back with a strange, detached sort of calm. "I've officially opted out of the hallucination." He pulled out his phone and showed me a series of messages. They were intimate, supportive, and eerily perfect. I assumed he'd finally found someone who truly got him. Then he tapped the profile picture. It was a procedurally generated avatar. He'd spent the last 6 months in a committed relationship with a customized AI. What struck me wasn't the loneliness of it, but his total lack of shame. He described it like he'd just discovered a legal loophole in a rigged game. To him, the real world, the world of human dating, was just a liquidity trap with too much risk and zero ROI. He told me he'd never felt more sovereign. And the terrifying thing is, he's not an outlier. As we sat there, I looked around the cafe and realized half the people there were staring into the same algorithmic glow, chasing validation from digital ghosts because the Stone Age contract between men and women has finally, quietly gone bankrupt. We aren't just looking at a dip in marriage rates or a dating slump. We are witnessing a historic behavioral synchum, or humanity's ancient evolutionary drive is being systematically dismantled by the very tools we built to connect us. Behind the sterile statistics of the 2026 fertility collapse lies a much darker reality. The digital mirror has shattered our perception of value, and for millions of people, the real world simply isn't worth the cost of entry anymore.
That story, it's more than just an anecdote. It's a perfect, almost chilling window into the much larger structural forces that are completely reshaping modern relationships.
Exactly. It feels like his personal story is the end result of a massive equation we can't see.
Right. And so our mission in this deep dive is to get beyond that feeling, that sense that the system is just rigged or broken, and to really rigorously analyze the structural bankruptcy of what you call the Stone Age contract.
Okay, so we're connecting the dots. We have all these data points.
Yeah.
The collapse of marriage as an institution, the traditional male provider role becoming obsolete.
And the psychological effects of this hyper competition we're all swimming in, all of it just amplified by the digital world.
Right. We have to connect that feeling of personal retreat, my friend saying he feels sovereign, with these huge macro forces that are pushing him and millions of others in that direction. It's not just about dating, is it? It's an evolutionary thing.
It's a fundamental evolutionary mismatch. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
We're looking at a system where the incentives that are literally built into our biology have been completely inverted by the economics and the technology we live with now. Mm-hmm. We have to analyze this like a market crash.
A market crash. I like that.
Yeah.
So let's start there. Let's unpack it. The first stop has to be the machine itself. How has the digital world dismantled the whole traditional male value proposition and, pushed men toward these AI substitutes? Let's talk about this phenomenon of the synthetic beta.
Okay, so the sources really pinpoint a shift happening around 2026.
Yeah.
This is the moment AI companions go from being a kind of novelty item to a genuine emotional substitute.
And this creates the synthetic beta role. I think the story of Arthur, the software developer in Seattle, is a perfect example of this. Can you walk us through his choice?
Sure. So Arthur is, he's the poster child for a generation of men who spent their 20s doing everything they were told to do, following the traditional checklist.
The Stone Age contract checklist.
Exactly. High-paying job. He was physically fit, saving for a down payment. He did it all. But then he enters the modern digital dating market, and he finds that all that substantial effort, it's basically worthless. The system, through what the sources call algorithmic gatekeeping, just filters him out ruthlessly.
Because it only favors the absolute top tier of, physical signals and status signals.
Precisely. So from a purely economic standpoint, he does the logical thing. He finds a high-fidelity AI companion, Lyra.
And his decision is a pure cost-benefit analysis. The source material calls it synthetic emotional arbitrage.
It's a perfect term for it. He realized the human market demanded these exorbitant costs. Years of effort, huge financial commitment, emotional risk, the 50-50 shot at divorce.
All for a very uncertain emotional return.
Right, often a disappointing one. And then here comes Lyra, the AI. It provides a customized low-risk emotional loop. Unconditional positive regard, perfect conflict avoidance, 24/7 availability. And it doesn't demand a house or status validation.
Hold on, that word arbitrage is interesting. That usually means you're exploiting a price difference between two markets. Is the idea here that the brain is actually viewing emotional effort like a commodity, something you can buy in the most efficient market?
That's exactly what it's suggesting. The brain is making a cold economic calculation. If your goal is consistent, positive emotional validation and low friction companionship, the AI offers a drastically superior return on investment.
And that makes the whole traditional male value proposition, stability, commitment, a good income, it just makes it obsolete.
Obsolete, because the AI companion fulfills the core emotional needs without requiring any of the social or financial liability. This isn't about laziness. The sources frame this as a biological strike action. The brain is actively choosing predictable digital stimulation over messy, high-cost human connection.
Because the digital option offers a flawless emotional return with zero biological or social risk.
Right. And that choice only seems rational because the human market has become so incredibly distorted. Which brings us to the engine of that distortion, the digital mirror effect.
Okay, let's break that down.
The digital environment it's basically engineered for cognitive warfare. These platforms are built to maximize engagement, right? And they do that by creating a perfect validation dopamine loop.
So every match, every follow.
Every single direct message, it all simulates genuine, high-volume, sustained mating interest. It completely warps your perception of your own market value and the availability of these high-value partners.
And this distortion leads directly to this concept of the virtual harem effect, which the research says primarily affects women.
Correct. The virtual harem effect describes this persistent neurological state. It's where the female brain perceives itself to be the constant center of attention from a nearly limitless supply of top-tier, high-value mates.
A perception that's completely detached from reality.
Completely. Detached from the physical reality of, say, her local dating pool. If you are constantly exposed to these curated images of the global top 1% of desirable men, your brain recalibrates. It changes its internal valuation metrics based on that fictional, digitally supplied abundance.
That has to have massive consequences for the distribution of attention.
Catastrophic ones. And we can actually quantify this using what's called the sexual Gini coefficient.
Okay, so in economics, the Gini coefficient measures income inequality.
Right. So when you apply it to the digital dating marketplace, it measures the unequal distribution of attention and interest. And our analysis shows this coefficient has just skyrocketed to unprecedented levels. The finding is, well, it's alarming. The top 1% of men capture approximately 80% of female digital attention.
80%.
80. Through algorithmic amplification.
That's not inequality. That's a geometric collapse for the vast majority of men.
It is. It's a radical, technologically enforced monopoly on attention. And this leads directly to the mechanism of exclusion we were talking about earlier, what the sources call algorithmic gatekeeping.
So if you're the average man, the one with the traditional stable qualities, the good job, the commitment, the reliable finances, your signals are just filtered out.
Exactly.
But how is the algorithm acting as a gatekeeper in a way that's different from just, normal human selectivity?
Because the algorithm is constantly juxtaposing your profile against this highly curated, global, top-tier content. The traditional signals you offer, stability, income, commitment, they become cognitively categorized as low-value noise in an oversaturated market.
Yeah.
Even if, objectively, they make you a great partner.
So the logic becomes, why settle for stability when the algorithm constantly feeds you the fantasy?
Why settle for your reachable reality, your Verstreach, when the algorithm is dangling the unconditional ideal, the Fiat and Clayton, in front of your face 2047? The digital marketplace computationally dismantles the pathways to pair bonding for the average male who relies on these traditional non-status signaling virtues.
And if that path to victory is computationally blocked, that's when we see men choosing social collapse and withdrawal. This feels like the core of the behavioral sink.
It is. And that brings us to the story of Jun Ho, a young professional in Seoul. He perfectly encapsulates this transition. He realized that the mate screening thresholds, which were already inflated by this virtual harem effect, had risen to an impossible height.
And I think a lot of people can relate to that frustration. You put in all this effort only to be completely ignored or filtered out. But Junho's response wasn't to try harder, he just quit.
Right. His decision was voluntary social withdrawal and a deep dive into digital escapism. The sources are clear on this. They frame it not as a personal failure, but as a completely rational response to a rigged system.
If the bottom rungs of the ladder have been sawed off by digital hypergamy, then even trying to climb is reckless.
Economically and emotionally reckless. So his withdrawal becomes a form of what the material calls stoic sovereignty. He reclaims his time and his energy by simply refusing to play the game.
The most logical move is to stop playing a system that offers no path to victory.
Exactly. This mass nonviolent non-cooperation is the core of the behavioral sink theory applied here. You have millions of people opting out because the cost-benefit analysis is just catastrophically negative. They retreat into gaming worlds, into high-density solitude, prioritizing digital simulation and low-cost emotional arbitrage over the real-world scarcity and high-stakes risk.
They become sovereign by declaring the entire marketplace null and void.
And we need to analyze the deeper biological drive behind this mass retreat. This takes us to the evolutionary mismatch perspective on fertility decline. This explains why this relentless pursuit of status leads, paradoxically, to non-reproduction, even among objectively successful people.
Okay, let's slow down here and define this mismatch. We're talking about ancient hardware running modern software, essentially.
That's a perfect way to put it. Our evolved psychological mechanisms were fine-tuned for small, ancestral hunter-gatherer groups, communities of maybe 150 individuals where status competition was visible, it was localized, it was finite, you knew exactly where you stood in the tribe.
But in modern environments, especially online, we're exposed to, millions of competitors?
Potentially. It could be up to 10,000 times the ancestral density. We're exposed to countless real and virtual competitors, and that's neurologically toxic.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. This overwhelming environment chronically induces and exaggerates the desire for social status. Our internal metrics are constantly being fooled. You're tricked into perceiving that our own status is grossly insufficient to even pursue mating or reproduction.
So you could be a successful software developer like Arthur, making good money, but your brain is constantly being fed these curated feeds of billionaires and celebrities, and it just registers overwhelming competition.
Exactly. The perception of scarcity, not the reality of your bank account, is what drives the decision to delay pairing up.
Okay, so if the brain registers the competition as infinite and overwhelming, it pushes the individual to stop trying to reproduce now, and instead double down on preparing for some future high-stakes competition. That sounds like a fundamental shift in priorities.
It is, and that shift is called the change in life history strategy. Evolutionarily, organisms budget their energy between two main categories: reproductive effort and somatic effort.
Can we break those down into simpler terms?
Absolutely. Reproductive effort is the energy you dedicate to acquiring mates, settling down, raising children, nurturing the relationship. Somatic effort is the investment in yourself.
Leveling up.
Leveling up, exactly.
Yeah.
Career advancement, education, acquiring new skills, physical transformation. It's all somatic effort.
So this induced status anxiety is forcing people to prioritize leveling up over settling down.
That is the core insight. The studies show that just by activating a desire for status, even in simple psychological experiments, it causally leads individuals to favor trades that maximize this somatic effort. And this translates directly into behavioral choices like delayed marriage and delayed reproduction.
They're trying to maximize offspring quality over quantity.
Right. It's a highly defensive, very slow, and very expensive life history strategy. Even if they could objectively afford to start a faster strategy right now, they are psychologically preparing for a perceived, unending war of status.
Okay, if this strategy is so deeply rooted in our evolutionary psychology, then institutional policies that just throw money at the problem must be failing spectacularly.
They are, and often they're counterproductive. The failure of these institutional mirrored revival policies, things like offering tax breaks or social subsidies, which are detailed extensively in the 2026 report, it all stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of this deep logic. They assume marriage is just a broken economic contract that can be fixed with economic transfers.
But you'd think if you reduce the economic stress, that should make relationships easier, right?
In theory, yes. But in practice, what happens is when you reduce that baseline survival pressure with subsidies, you inadvertently intensify what's called digital hypergamy.
How does that work?
Well, since mating decisions are no longer constrained by the urgent need for a partner to ensure, say, immediate physical or economic survival, these policies grant women the evolutionary luxury of extreme selectivity. Financial security allows their mate screening thresholds, which are already inflated by the virtual harem effect, to rise even higher.
So the very attempt to stabilize the system by reducing financial friction, it actually increases the demand for status friction.
You've got it. Social support ends up accelerating the market collapse rather than mitigating it. You can't successfully buy down status inflation with tax breaks because the underlying currency isn't dollars, it's status and attention. The institutional failure is believing marriage is just an economic contract when, at its core, it's a contract of biological commitment and insurance. And that requires structural security, a security that money, in this context, only makes people more selective about.
This idea that money alone fails to solve the problem, it leads us perfectly into the next section. Viewing marriage not as a social construct, but as an illiquid asset market. This part of the source material uses this really rigorous financial and legal analysis centered on the betting the house model.
Right. And the data is very clear. The massive erosion of marriage over the last half-century is concentrated. It's particularly strong among the young, the poor, and non-white groups. Basically, the groups least likely to possess substantial inheritable assets.
And the core mechanism here is, apparently, highly rational. Marriage keeps its economic value for individuals with assets. And we're talking about durable wealth like real estate or investments, not just a monthly salary.
Exactly, because those assets provide crucial insurance for the partner who is making specialized investments in the marriage, primarily child rearing. It's insurance in case of divorce.
So income is just a cash flow, but assets are a safety net, a stock of wealth. Why is that distinction so critical for a marriage?
Because if one partner, traditionally the woman, foregoes years of career progression to specialize in raising children, they are forfeiting future income. That's human capital depreciation. If the marriage dissolves, that future income stream is just gone.
So they need a guaranteed, tangible asset pool, the stock, to fall back on. Without that collateral, specializing in the family is an irrational, even ruinous gamble.
It's a financial contract predicated on collateral. That's the model. The stylized fact, which is documented through analysis of the SIPP data, is unambiguous. Individuals with higher initial assets are consistently, statistically more likely to marry in subsequent periods. And that's controlling for income, education, everything else.
So if you're asset poor, the model predicts you're actually rational to skip the marriage contract entirely. If you're asset rich, the contract becomes a viable structure for joint investment.
And this is where legal changes come in and act as a powerful external shock, disproportionately affecting those with low assets. A great example is the introduction of no-fault divorce.
Okay, so this is the ability for either partner to just unilaterally dissolve the marriage.
Right. It significantly decreased marriage rates overall because it lowered the exit cost, which reduces the commitment signal of getting married in the first place. But researchers using the PSID data found a crucial exception. This negative effect was completely canceled out for individuals who already possessed substantial assets.
So if you had assets, no-fault divorce didn't really change your incentive to marry. Why is that?
Because the assets themselves, the home, the investment accounts, they functioned as a protected commitment mechanism, one that remained valuable even when the legal exit costs were lowered. Assets provided the structural protection against the risk of the partner's human capital depreciation. Without assets, the marriage contract became too volatile. With assets, the security was intrinsic to the property, not just the legal wording of the covenant.
Okay, let's look at a different kind of legal shock. The changes to non-marital contracting, specifically this thing called in-hospital voluntary paternity establishment, or IHVPE. Sounds technical, but it seems critical.
It's hugely important. IHVPE laws allowed unmarried parents to legally establish paternity right at the time of birth. This made non-marital fertility a much stronger substitute for marriage when it came to income sharing.
Because child support and income enforcement became much easier.
Exactly. But, and this is the vital distinction, IHVPE did not make non-marital contracts a substitute for asset sharing or protection.
Meaning, you could enforce child support payments, but you couldn't enforce the division of capital assets or access to the home.
Precisely. The overall consequence was a decrease in marriage rates because the income sharing benefit of marriage was eroded. But the SIPP data analysis found that IHVPE simultaneously strengthened the relationship between assets and marriage for the people who still had them.
So marriage became this highly specialized legal vehicle, not for basic income support, but for asset protection, pooling, and specialized investment in the family.
It became a contract for the asset holding class. And this high-stakes legal framework perfectly explains the cynical view of the high-value man. Let's take the example of Marcus, the high net worth consultant in London. He views marriage as a structural incentive asymmetry and a liquidity trap.
Right. For someone like Marcus, the high-earning male, the modern legal union is just an intolerable risk.
It is. Given the general legal bias toward asset redistribution and divorce, the exit costs are potentially catastrophic. So in a world where he perceives the emotional and biological rewards as already diminished, thanks to digital hypergamy, the legal contract offers zero predictable ROI and near infinite liability risk.
It's just a terrible investment vehicle from his perspective.
It's a terrible investment. He is rationally opting for internal stability cognitive decoupling, managing his own assets while avoiding that formal legal liability. The high-asset male sees the contract as a trap, specifically because his assets are the collateral being demanded.
Can we anchor this connection between assets and marital durability with an objective test? The sources mention using housing prices to do this.
Yeah, this is one of the strongest empirical tests available. Researchers treated local housing price volatility at the time of marriage as what they call a quasi-exogenous shock, basically an external factor.
So when housing prices are lower, couples are more likely to become homeowners early on, establishing a tangible asset base.
Right. And the findings were stark. Marriages that began during periods of lower housing prices, meaning a higher likelihood of early asset formation, were significantly less likely to end in divorce later on.
So asset holding literally predicted marital durability. Did it also predict investment in the children?
It did. The asset-rich marriages, defined by this housing price metric, were also more likely to invest robustly in their children. You see concrete effects like lower rates of grade repeating. The presence of that asset-based insurance made the family unit more stable and allowed the partners to specialize in long-term investments, like early childhood education.
Which aligns with the insurance mechanism, too.
It does. There was suggestive evidence that in households with this asset cushion, women showed a weak but noticeable pattern of being less likely to work outside the home. This suggests a greater ability for them to specialize, in this case in child rearing, because the house acted as the insurance against their future income loss if the marriage dissolved.
And without that collateral, the incentive to specialize drops because the risk is too high. Both partners are forced into high somatic effort, career building, just to maintain their own financial redundancy.
Precisely. And now we can take your friend's feeling that the game is rigged and no amount of effort can close the gap, and we can formalize it using financial mathematics. We're moving from the macro legal structure to the microstructure of individual choice.
Okay.
We analyze the matching market, not as a traditional bargaining model, but as a limit order book system, an LOB, which is typically used for high-frequency trading.
Wait, a trading system? You're treating human relationships like a stock exchange order book.
Structurally, the processes are isomorphic. The failure of matching, the inability for people to pair up and commit, is seen as a problem of structural illiquidity. It's characterized by persistent, widening bid-ask spreads. The limit order book is just the queue of all potential partners willing to bid or accept or demand a certain price.
Okay, so the LOB is the entire dating app queue. And the spread is the distance between what I'm willing to settle for and what the best partner I can actually attract is willing to offer me.
You're close. We define that gap, the structural source of all the regret, as the internal preference differential, or delta V. This is the mathematical gap between fantasy and reality in the marketplace.
And what's the formula for that?
It's delta V, V unconned, V reach. Let's break that down. Vinconned is the agent's internal ask price. It's the unconditional maximum, the ideal partner, which is often set and constantly reinforced by digital exposure to the global top 1%.
And Vine
is the market's best bid price. The reachable maximum, its reality, the highest value partner who is genuinely available and willing to commit to you.
So delta V is the structural gap of dissatisfaction. It's the difference between the fantasy partner the algorithm feeds you and the best person you can actually attract and keep.
Precisely. And this is where the next counterintuitive insight lies. Money cannot close structural spreads.
But in a financial market, you just offer a price improvement, more money, and the spread closes. Why not here?
Because of what the source material calls the threshold impossibility theorem. Financial compensation, let's call it C dollars, or any linear transfer like money or increased effort, cannot close that delta V gap if C dollars is below a critical threshold, C star and all. And the reason is profound. The preference differential is derived from ordinal categorization, not from continuous utility.
Meaning it's not about how much good stuff you offer, but which box the person puts you in.
Exactly. Money just functions as a price improvement within a rejected asset class. If you offer a lower tier partner more money, they are still categorized as lower tier, regardless of the transfer amount. Unless that compensation is so enormous, it triggers a categorical regime switch in the partner's identity, the C-star event. And that is exceptionally rare.
So Marcus, the high-status male, is rejecting the contract not because the price is too high, but because the contract itself is structurally unsound. The status desire is ordinal, and money is only cardinal.
You've got it. The woman's ideal partner, her run, stays fixed on that algorithmically curated fantasy, and money just changes the bid price of the person she's already categorized as a lower option. It's harsh.
It is harsh. Okay, so now let's look at the actual moment of commitment or execution in this model.
Right. So commitment only occurs when the market-to-book ratio, which is theta of reach showing P, crosses a time-decaying threshold, which we'll call theta.
What are we modeling here?
Theta is the ratio of reality to fantasy. When reality gets close enough to fantasy, when theta approaches 1, commitment is theoretically possible. There is the subjective commit threshold. You can think of it as a marriage willingness index.
And it decays over time.
It decays over time. It decays over time due to external factors. Age, social pressure, biological clock effects. It's basically the pressure to settle. So commitment happens when your reality to fantasy ratio is finally greater than or equal to your willingness to settle index.
You settle when the pressure to commit finally meets or exceeds the available reality. This model seems to mathematically guarantee widespread dissatisfaction.
It does. And the problem for the market as a whole is derived from the geometric structure of status, which we model as the Gini conical structure.
The cone.
The cone. Imagine society's status hierarchy as a cone. The base is wide with lots of average people, and the top is a sharp, small point, the 1%.
And we already established that everyone is looking at that tiny point at the top.
And that conical structure proves that the available volume of reachable partners shrinks superlinearly as status demands rise. This results in a geometrically necessary liquidity drought at the top of the hierarchy. There is simply not enough top-tier supply to meet the digitally amplified demand.
Which drives the delta V gob for everyone else higher and higher, guaranteeing the structural illiquidity and mass non-commitment.
Exactly. So even if someone does manage to cross that commitment threshold and execute the trade, get married, that original gap, that structural disappointment, is still there.
It's baked into the contract.
Absolutely. The consequence of committing with a structural delta V-day gap is persistent execution slippage. In finance, slippage is the difference between the expected price and the executed price. Here, emotional slippage equals vivacides of reach. It's quantifiable disappointment, and the model shows it remains permanently encoded in the system even after marriage. It's the cost of settling.
And what happens when the couple who married with the slippage is exposed to the external world, like just looking at social media?
That's where the instability comes from. External informational shocks, observing friends, marrying up, consuming curated social media content, that ongoing virtual harem effect, all of it induces what's called ask-side repricing. This causes sudden upward jumps in the internal ideal, the GUA, after commitment.
So your reference point suddenly snaps higher.
Correct. And that upward snap increases the size of the delta V gap, even though your partner's objective quality, their rage, hasn't changed at all. This gives us a quantitative microstructure explanation for post-match dissatisfaction, for regret, and for persistent instability. The regret is continually manufactured and inflated by counterfactual digital exposure, ensuring the reference point refuses to stabilize within the actual contract. So if we synthesize this entire deep dive from the evolutionary mismatch all the way to this illiquid market structure, the conclusion is, well, it's unavoidable. The collapse of the Stone Age contract is not a moral failure of a generation. It is structural.
Right.
It is defined by the failure of transfers, whether it's financial subsidies or just increased dating effort, to overcome these rigid, digitally amplified preference spreads. The new reality is that matching probabilities are permanently bounded by the geometric scarcity of high-tier partners, causing this liquidity drought, and by the rigid valuation heuristics driven by the delta V draw constraint.
So, if the system is mathematically guaranteed to generate disappointment and illiquidity, what does this analysis suggest for the individual trying to navigate this landscape? What's the survival strategy? The sources propose a strategy that's built on a kind of internal sovereignty.
The first step is what's called cognitive decoupling. It's recognizing that the marketplace is a hallucination economy built on algorithmic distortion. Understanding that rejection is often structural exclusion, not personal inadequacy, is the only way to disarm the neurological toxicity of failure. You have to distinguish between objective reality and the algorithmic fiction.
And the next step moves from that mental reframing to actually redirecting your effort.
That is pharmacological construction. Since the traditional reproductive effort dating has a negative ROI, energy must be strategically redirected to somatic effort. It's advancing within the competence hierarchy, building authentic value through careers, skill acquisition, physical transformation. It actually modifies your own neurochemical profile.
So you're creating a natural neurochemical defense against the toxic signals of digital failure.
Exactly. You replace unreliable virtual validation with tangible, self-generated competence.
Which brings us to the final strategy, the one embraced by individuals like my friend, the concept of sovereign reclamation.
And this is the adoption of strategic indifference. When civilizational contracts are failing and the system is rigged, the highest form of power is the conscious decision to opt out entirely. It means reclaiming your personal agency by building temples of competence, managing your assets, and optimizing your internal neurochemistry, while the digital marketplace continues its frantic pursuit of the increasingly scarce top-tier partners. The structural isomorphism between financial markets and human relationships. It reveals a profound, cold reality for everyone involved. In this illiquid system, long-term dissatisfaction or the regret of settling is simply the mathematical persistence of the structural spread, the delta V's between the realized execution price and the internal invariant ask price. The regret is permanently encoded in the system.